This is the API Intersection, where you'll get insights from experienced API practitioners to learn best practices on things like API design, governance, identity, auth, versioning, and more. All right. Thanks for listening to API Intersection Podcast. We're here today with Dileep Krishnan, currently at Oracle, but Dileep's been a lot of interesting places and more importantly has done a lot of interesting stuff in kind of the API space, notably with his time at InfoQ as an editor. Also, my co-host today is Anna, one of my coworkers at Stoplight. Anna, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Anna Doherty. I am the product marketing manager at Stoplight, a very new role at Stoplight, but really excited to spread the word.
Cool. Dileep, anything else interesting you want to tell us about yourself before we start peppering you with questions?
No, I'm happy to chat. I've been in the API and integration space for God knows how long, maybe close to life of my career, I guess, 15, 20 years. I think I take pride in calling myself a Rastafarian, if you will.
Nice.
It can be polarizing in terms of getting people either on your side or away from you, but I'm really passionate about using the web for the properties it gives, the benefits that it just natively gives you, and all the things that Roy Fielding put out there. That's where I'm coming from, and I'm happy to chat with anything that you'd like to chat about.
Cool. Well, I think, the gray in my beard usually shows it if you're watching the video version for listeners, but I've been around doing this stuff a long time too, and what's funny is when we kind of said, who do we want to be guests? I had you on my list, and I realized when I started looking at some of the stuff you'd written, it was from 10 years ago. And you've done more since then, but it was like particular pieces that you had written back then that I was like, oh, I've had this on my list. This is somebody I'd like to know more about. So as far as kind of that, and you ended up as an editor at InfoQ, and it seemed like that was kind of your wheelhouse, was this sort of API bucket. So what kind of took you down that road, and what's what motivates you to kind of do all this developer community and writing stuff?
That's interesting. So I've been always passionate about integration problems. So I started just link blogging, right? That was a thing 15 years ago, like. Blog interesting things that you find on the internet and collect it in a list of links and then share it with everybody. So I was doing that fairly regularly, and then Stefan Delkov, who's he's pretty well known in the community for his thought leadership in REST and basically starting from even before that, from SOA, and how that transitioned into something using the REST architecture. So somehow it caught his attention, and he figured it'll be a great idea for me to join the InfoQ team and participate in the SOA vertical of that. I mean, it has different things, right? Like Java development, enterprise architecture, .NET development. One of those pillars was SOA. So that's how I got interested in writing. I really love writing because, as a software developer, I'm quite an introvert. But when I'm writing, it's easy. You don't have to worry about your inhibitions, and you just write what you know about, what you care about. So that's how I got into that, and I really enjoyed it for quite a while. And then job pressures just took over. It's really hard if you're not able to give 100% to your writing. So I stopped working on InfoQ content maybe 10 years ago, I think, close to 10 years ago. So, but the relationships and the the community interactions that you get from it is just amazing. So especially in the space that I'm interested in. So yeah, I loved it.
Cool. Yeah, I was actually just sharing some Richard Feynman quotes with our team the other day. My favorite being that the ultimate test of your knowledge is your capacity to convey it to another. I love like how much you learn in teaching things. Yeah,
exactly. That is exactly how you learn. Teach it to other people.
And I can totally resonate with losing touch with writing. It's why I end up doing lazy stuff like podcasting. I can still share and get ideas out.
It's not really it's not really that easy that you claim it is. I mean, podcasting is quite an art as well. Keeping people engaged in audio format is not easy as well. So,
yeah,
kudos for you guys to start it.
Thanks.
I have a question for you on that topic, Dilip. Yeah. What advice do you have to developers who are interested in sharing their knowledge, and what skills could they develop to be better writers?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I would say first, just take topics that you really care about. I mean, don't write for the sake of writing. Like if you really care about something, just go deep into it and pick some easy, like small sliver of thing that you want to write about, and then once you do that, the idea is just put something on paper. Just get your outline out there, and then refine it so that it's the most succinct form of communication that you can deliver to the audience. And then, I mean, that itself takes a long while. You can write a lot of things, but writing good content is really not easy, especially in a technical space. It's definitely not easy. So it's also a good muscle to build if you want to be an individual contributor in any organization, for example. You don't have to really manage people to lead. Like writing is a form of communication where, like, it's an easy way for you to influence people. And of course, now there's more forms of those content that you can produce, like audio, like video content, Twitch, and this humongous number of platforms that you can express yourself. But writing is also like equally important. There are people who love to read really quickly and skim articles, and there's people who love to hear. So there's different ways that people interact with content, and writing is one of the important ones too. So yeah, that's definitely a skill, especially if you want to communicate in organizations to build consensus on things that you want to work on. That's a really important skill to build. To actually influence people, influence peers around you and developers around you.
Especially if you're an introvert, right? You got to be able to express yourself.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I often coach kind of developing or growing developers that your technical leadership is often defined by the size of your sphere of influence, right? Rather than like the org chart may not make much difference. It's really who can you motivate and inspire and that sort of thing. And if you can't get what's in your head out, number one, that shows you haven't mastered the topic, right? And you've got to work on that. And number two, no one's going to know what's in your head. So,
exactly.
Well said.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I found it interesting that you were saying some of this stuff started from kind of the SOA era. And, I guess we all have Martin Fowler to thank for coming up with a catchphrase for microservices, right? This is totally meaningless, like beautiful way to sell consulting. But what was that kind of transition like for you moving from, and I was in that world too, this kind of SOA and SOAP and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And why do you think this is better or different now?
I think fundamentally, I think the difference is I want to take a step back. So we are going back. We're coming kind of full circle where we came from. So these things kind of repeat themselves over time. Like all these things that were a fad like 20 years ago have become a fad again. So Open API is kind of like that in a way. So where we started out with WS Star. and all the baggage that came with it, the huge amount of uh, like overhead that people had to take into consideration, all these different standards for security, for payload description, for your schemas and stuff like that. And then they said, no, we like the Web 2.0 came, and people said, we don't want all that. We just want to move fast and move quick and deliver stuff to the web. And that kind of gave rise to this like this pattern of just building quick APIs on top of just plain HTTP. They call it. I think they just made it XML over RPCs is what that transitioned into at that point in time, because there was really good tooling for XML. But that's the logical transition. People just didn't want to be encumbered by all this behemoth tooling that came down on them from these big giant software vendors like IBM, Microsoft, all these people that built all these standards. So that transition was like pretty seamless because the web took off, and the mind share was like, let's build these quick services on top of HTTP. We have clients that can easily talk. We have tooling for parsing and loading XML. Let's use that, and then two things together, and then you just have your clients consuming and talking to services in no time, right? So that transition really happened, and people were saying, okay, how can we make this better? And then we had JSON, which is like the neat, cool trick that Douglas Crockford came up with in JavaScript. So people said, hey, this is even better. There's even less tooling needed. So they just transitioned to HTML, HTTP APIs, and JSON talking over the wires. So JSON RPC came up. So, and then people said, okay, we're moving along just fine. And then people said, hey, but we don't want this cowboy kind of culture where everybody just slinks together some messages over the wire. Let's put some standards and let's make this a little bit more consumable. We have all these different services that need to talk to each other. Let's make it a little bit more readable. So that's when like the rumblings of standardization started happening again, and that's kind of how OpenAPI and I think other standards like RAML and stuff like that, they all took over from those kinds of things. It's a little bit unfortunate that none of the core tenets of RESTful architectures took over, because the tooling is still behind on those things. But yeah, I think to answer your question in a long-winded way, actually, the whole microservices just accelerated a lot of these things to moving towards the standardization of these representations, if you will.
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me is we've had, back in the SOA days, you called it out, right? A few companies came up with all these standards, and then everybody else used it because, well, they provided the tooling too. The difference for me in the last 10, 15 years has been that all of this came from just the community at large. So like OpenAPI, right? You got like Tony Tam writes this thing, right? That just comes up with Swagger as a way to spit out documentation, and fortuitously it becomes something else entirely. And I think a lot of the conventions of the norms of what good APIs look like has just come from people using stuff and saying, I like that one, right? And that just feedback has naturally fed it. I think the bit that I'm particularly curious about is, I've been through SOA governance boards as a developer, and it wasn't fun. I didn't relish the weeks and pedantic, idiosyncratic discussions I had to have. But when we look now at microservices and kind of, these platform initiatives, these kind of API programs, and some mechanism of governing that, and OpenAPI certainly seems to be bearing the torch for it. Absolutely. Do you see that, there's a difference, or are we just doing the same stupid thing again?
It's a lot more lightweight, and I think it goes back to tooling. I think that makes those collaborations easier. Like and like I think the difference is like earlier you would collaborate on like a Word document, and people would have like change tracking on, and then say, okay, I'm going to change this field, and then 10 people would review that, and people would miss things. It's just the tooling has evolved from that to some things that are available now. Right now, I think Stoplight is one of them that enables these tooling that allows you to collaborate on these different these workflows. Really, I think the workflows are really important, right? Like how you enable these workflows. I think that is the thing. Like for example, like all these are grassroots development that people found the need for it and built it, rather than companies feeling the need to sell something and build it. I think that's the difference. But really, if you look at it, like GitHub is another good example, right? Like people were like sharing zip files over email, and then GitHub comes along and dramatically increase the collaboration of people. You don't even like share the same time zone, but you just collaborate and comment on things and evolve your like SpringFox is that way, right? We're really lucky to have a lot of contributors, and that's another enabler, right? So I think that's the difference. It's come in full circles, but the tooling is a lot better to do that. There's also other flavors of tooling. It's not only the design time tooling. There's also other flavors, but yeah, we can talk about that too. But yeah, I think that's the fundamental difference between the WSDL and like OpenAPI. I think that's the it's just the evolution of where technology comes from, right? So
Yeah. No, it's funny. I was just telling Anna earlier, I was bragging on Mike Amundsen. He's my favorite like API historian to always bring us down to earth and remind us there's nothing new, right? Everything's reinvention. But I think
he's terrific. I love his work. And
totally.
And I think it's just the amount of content that he puts out there to still keep this grand vision that Roy Fielding put out is just amazing. So
it is difficult to sometimes match that idealism of what REST could have been from a 15-year-old kind of concept or more into what it is now and what it has to be, because some of that, it's like the finite state machine to make all hypermedia possible. It doesn't happen very often, right?
But the very cool thing is that I don't know if you've heard of this conference called RESTfest, and I was part of that luckily for like a couple of years. And the amount of it was really an unconference, if you will, and the amount of really cool progress you were making at just these hackathons that we had there. I really wish some of those would have just gone into the wild and taken off.
I did RESTfest, I think, for a year or two. It's definitely a kind of a special
it's a
environment
mind-opening
where
conference. Yeah,
there's no agenda. Everyone just shows up and talks about something that they're passionate about, and like really novel ideas in there.
Correct.
So you mentioned SpringFox, which I'll admit I haven't used. I also haven't been kind of in the Java world in a while, which is where it felt like that kind of started. What's that project all about?
So SpringFox is basically what it is a library that allows, like, in the Java ecosystem, just to take a step back, has Spring. Spring is a technology, a web framework that is very popular in the Java ecosystem, and people build services on top of Spring. And Spring is also another like path-breaking kind of framework where it said, I don't want to be part of this huge J2EE marketing machine. I want to do something that's very accessible to developers and empower people to make changes really quickly. So Spring is born out of that. And so what SpringFox does is it is a library that's coexisting with the Spring services that people work on. And what it does is it takes a look at how these services are built and introspects using like basically code introspection, really. It looks at the code and says, oh, I see that you have a service that you're going to expose as an endpoint, and I see that you can take like name as a parameter or age as a parameter, and then I see that you can actually spit out employees, for example, with that particular name and maybe that age as a filter or what have you. So it looks at those definitions that you build in your services, and it makes sense of that, and then builds the specification, which is OpenAPI in this case. And so from that perspective, it is like a code first kind of approach for building your OpenAPI definitions. And it's obviously there's an endpoint you can hit and say, hey, show me all the OpenAPI definitions that you have as part of the service, and then it'll give you back that definition. So that's essentially what it does. But it's very niche, and it's very in the Spring ecosystem, and it's very in the Java ecosystem as well. So,
well, with 5,000 stars and appealing to Java, Spring, and Spring Boot developers, I think that's hardly niche. In fairness, I think you got pretty
I'm
good
actually
adoption
very
there.
lucky that it got very popular. I think it kind of rode the wave of the popularity of Swagger. So, and there was nothing in the market that did that. So, just building on top of that, I think, I mean, it's been a great learning opportunity in terms of building stuff, building libraries in the public, in open source, and curating that, making sure that people are not having like when it started out, it was pretty rocky, I think. Like it started out and people were like, what is this? like there would be there'd be a storm of comments saying, oh, this is like really terrible library and blah, blah, blah. I mean, it just takes effort and time to commit to doing open source. It's very gratifying. At the same time, it takes a lot of time. But yeah, it's kind of a labor of love, if you will.
I love this idea of building because there's a problem and you're trying to solve the problem. What advice do you have for people who are kind of trapped in that sort of legacy architecture, or they're trapped in that backbreaking code? What advice would you have for those teams who want to move to a more modern way of developing?
Oh, that's a very tough question. I mean, it's not really easy. I mean, it's not really, there's no one answer for that, right? Like we're talking about a people problem here. We're not really talking about technology as such. We're trying to see, hey, how do you propose an idea, and how do you make sure that the idea takes off? It's like really.
How do you change minds?
Yeah, it's really hard, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, just to take a non-technology example, right? Like if let's say Adele makes a song and she's like totally stoked about it and says, yeah, this is going to be like a #1 chart topper, and people just like, nah, that doesn't make sense at all to me. So it's kind of like that, right? Like you don't know, you're just going to put your work out, the best work out there. Like you're going to propose your ideas, and the best one should win. So I think from that perspective, I think from an organization perspective, it's really about the leaders making sure that you build a culture of like collaboration and like celebrating good ideas, right? Like you build that into your organization. It's not like me as an individual can have the best idea, but definitely the wisdom of the crowd, like at least in the organization, is really what, like, I think we just need to build that culture in the organization. That's really how you bring about that change. Like if 10 people think that this working on this legacy whatever tool that you have, and it takes like 5 days to get a deployment out. So there's only two options. You're like happy with your job and you say, okay, I'm going out on a vacation for 5 days and come back and check that the deployment is done. Or you come and say, hey, this is just not going to work because we're living in the age of the internet, and if we keep doing this, we're just going to go out of business. So there's obviously grays in the middle, but you got to either take those two broad strokes, like either you challenge the status quo or you go with what you have. And like I think organizations should just like encourage challenging the status quo to make things better. And I think that's the way to go. I mean, it's no individual can make that change.
Yeah, it's funny. In the original kind of show description, I was sort of forceful in saying we really need to address this culture change topic. And I think everybody kind of gave me the puzzled look like, okay, yeah, I guess. So I think this is our 7th episode. And it's come up in every episode so far when we talk about, what does kind of, building your API program look like. Inevitably, it's that you're accepting that a lot of things are about to change if you're going to go that route. And to your one point you made that I really love is you said, so there's 10 people that like doing it this way. Everybody else wants to move on. Is I always see that this turns into a question of how do you make decisions, right? And that the notion, people say, oh, well, we need consensus. Well, consensus just means majority. That's all it means, right? It's just a synonym. You don't have to make everyone happy. Sometimes you got to move on. And to your point, there's an existential crisis embedded in some of these things for companies. And I've been a member of some of those where you go like, wow, if we don't, move past this, it's not going to be pretty. So,
correct. Yeah, I think also it's like oftentimes it's like you have this analysis paralysis. Like, so you have these meetings to have consensus, and then these meetings turn into like weeks and months, and just goes on, and all you ended up doing was talking in those meetings. And like I think it like a lot of times like I always say, bias towards action is the way to go. You just plant your stake in the ground, and you say, this is how I've done it. Now, if you have a better idea, let's hear it, kind of thing, like a straw man, if you will. So.
Yeah, sometimes just doing an idea, whether or not it's a bad one, is better than doing nothing at all, and then you just learn to iterate fast.
Exactly.
So, I mean, without, I guess, bringing it down to earth, right? I mean, this is a lot of kind of pithy stuff that I believe in, it's true, but if to speaking to listeners here who are going, I think I want to do all these great things that I hear about on the show, but I'm in a place where, gosh, I don't know how to get started. Like, what do you think like a tangible first step is to kind of building that momentum toward, changing the way everything works without, tipping the apple cart?
That's also another hard problem.
We work in hard problems, Dilip.
But I would say, I would say starting with like, values in the organization. I think that's the fundamental thing. I think defining values in your organization makes a big difference. I think the famous anecdote from Amazon is that Jeff Bezos said, hey, everything that we build must be built on services. And if it's not built on services, we're not going to ship it. So I think those are the kinds of things, those are the kinds of values, I think, that drive these kinds of momentum. Like, it doesn't have to, you don't have to even do anything. I think defining those values in itself is just going to it's just going to make people ask for the question, like, do I want to go down this path? Is it aligning with my values? in the organization? If it is, I want to go forward with that. I think just that basic step itself is a lot of people just get caught up because they don't have that. They just like have all these ideas that are like really there's so many talented developers and everybody has a good idea. It's just making sure that you align it with the values and goals of the organization. I think that is the really fundamental important thing. It's the net, the safety net that you keep for yourself in the organization that says, okay, it's your guardrails. This is where we want to go. If you go off this beaten path, then you're just off on the grasslands. You're not in the road. So I think I would start with that.
I'm pretty sure I've said it before on here, but an organization cannot rise above the constraints of its leadership. Definitely one of the things I believe in. And, I think this idea that, I don't know, it's 2021. I'm just going to say it like, if you're in a place and you don't see momentum happening on, kind of building a more modern API-based platform and leadership doesn't get why, take a shot at it, take a run at it, be passionate, and if you get fired for trying, move on, because there's plenty of other places that are ready to go right now. And I think, I go down this road at every show of like, how do we get started? But I think let's presuppose that we have, kind of the mandate. And I think we keep hearing that on the show here too, is like, if you don't have that mandate, that like we're going to be a platform now, we're going to be API powered, then, you either help start it or move on. But let's assume we have that.
Great.
So in terms of like, how do you do that without chaos breaking loose, right? I mean, we said before, like the cowboy culture thing that kind of happened for a little while there. How do we rein that in?
Yeah, it's going to be I don't know how to answer that, but like if you really look at the ecosystems around, like whatever ecosystem you take, like I know DevOps is kind of a new practice that's really taking off, but all of those things are pretty much enabled by this whole underlying idea that there's an API for something that you can do. Like you take even like something like Kubernetes. It's powered by an API that lets you do things to orchestrate your pretty much your data center, if you will. Like Terraform is another thing. Like everything that you do, like in the cloud, for example, everything that you do in maybe like Amazon or Google or even like Oracle, where I work currently, OCI, everything is powered by APIs. So if you don't do something that allows you to do automation and agility, it really grants you that agility to move forward, right? Faster by just like you don't have to talk to somebody to provision a machine. How much power is that when you compare that to like even like 10 years ago, where you had to go to the system administrator and say, hey, can you please create me a VM and when can you have that done by? Can you have that by next week?
Or like the old guy jokes that, some of the other folks do is like, do you remember driving to the data center at 3 a.m?
Exactly.
Because a cable went bad.
Correct.
Like, I don't miss that.
Exactly. So yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's like if you really have to survive, especially like I think this whole pandemic has accelerated that whole idea that you need to be able to work remotely, and like I think the fundamental currency of being able to do that is an API. So if you don't have a program for that, then you are going to be left behind pretty quickly. So I think a lot of leaders realize that, like even DevOps for that matter, like a lot of people are realizing that the power of moving fast, breaking things like how Facebook does it, is really powerful. So.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that API transformations are almost always coupled with DevOps transformations, because you really can't have one without the other, especially if you're breaking out some monolithic application into a series of different pipelines and things.
Exactly.
If you're going to do that the old way, it's not going to go fast. So,
Correct.
yeah.
And also, I think it's the people problem aspect of it is that, and this whole microservices ties in with that. Is that like this coordination, this effort of coordination between different teams, different people, like this Conway's law comes into play and says, okay, if you're structured this way, then you have to do it in this way, and like so it's all the more reason that you want to limit these areas where you're having these collaboration needs which don't need to be there. So it just breaks those boundaries. So I think that's the power of that that it gives you, right? So you're more agile because of that.
Yeah, it's funny when you look at DevOps and like what it's taken in that side of the world, and you look at somebody like Nicole Forsgren and kind of the Westrum typology and like, PhD level research looking at what are the cultural facets that need to exist to make this happen. The same is true, right? You're talking about changing the way you work. Which I'm certainly becoming a big subscriber to that approach. We're starting to use that with our team as well. But this idea that you really need to measure and care about culture, and that look for tools to do that. And it's interesting to see that like what we learned in the DevOps side of the world in many ways is beginning to inform how we might approach building APIs at scale in general.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I wanted to circle back on your Spring Fox thing here, because you mentioned that you've built a library that sort of is this code first approach, and I'm curious, as you've seen, at least I feel like, and I certainly have a biased opinion, it seems like there's more and more kind of direction toward design first. What have you seen in kind of that change, or is code first still kind of prevalent in your mind, or is there a right or wrong here?
I don't know whether it's right or wrong. So I can tell you what I feel about it. I know that the API first is really gaining a lot of popularity because you have upfront collaboration before you even write a piece of code, right? Like you just say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think? And then you can collaborate and say, oh, I don't like that. I like that.
So, but I'm going to pause. I'm going to stop you there because you said
Sure.
You used a different term, which is API first. You didn't use design first, which is okay. But for me, this is another one of those Fowler made up microservices, and then we had to figure out what it meant. I feel like API first is still somewhat in what does that mean? So what does API first mean for you?
I actually that was like a slip, but I meant to say design first. But API first is just this whole goes back to this Amazon idea of service first. Build it, like the top of the pyramid is building your APIs. But what I meant to say was design first.
Okay, that's right. It's cool. I'm just making sure. It's been interesting asking people that question. You get different looks at it. So, okay, go on. Design first.
Yeah, I think design first lets you do that, right? Like this upfront collaboration. So you don't have to have a huge team of developers building services. So there's just a natural appeal to that. Like a CTO would like to just see what it kind of looks like and be able to just collaborate on something and say, can you just take a look at this and then talk to somebody from a different team and say, do you think you can interact with this? Does this make sense? So it's a very nice conversational tool. Whereas when you go code first, you don't have that. The organization is very different. The profile of that organization that does one versus the other is very different. Code first organization is something that's very how do I say? It's an open source kind of model where people are free to change things in other teams' repositories and things like that nature to make sure that things work in the right direction. It's not I'm not trying to make it so that it's like it's again going back to cowboy code where like you just go change randomly something. It obviously has to go through the vetting process, but it happens at the code level, not at the API interaction design level.
Yeah, most people call this like an inner source approach, which I would generally argue is, another one of those transformational things you see with API development.
Correct. So I think it just is whatever suits your organization that makes sense, like how your organization collaborates, how your organization works. Like one has trade-offs over the other. But having said that, I think I have a strong bias towards the code side of things, and I'll tell you why. The reason I have it is because, like I mentioned earlier, my background is from the SOA WS Star world, and when I came from there, I was a really hardcore like contract first development. Like let's define the contract, then we can think about everything else. So when and of course, granted that the tooling was not there at that time, but when you have that kind of an approach, what happens is that there's like when you have a mismatch between like a way to describe your API and what the code that you can use to generate from that description, when you have an impedance mismatch, like data types is a good example. Like if you take, for example, like a simple example I can give you right now in OpenAPI. If you take JSON schema, for example, you have the ability to define like union types. And if you take that and translate that to a concept in like a C-based language like Java or C#, there's just no way you can make that transition. You have to make some kind of translation that maps that into what your code represents. So from that perspective, right, it is you have to service the lowest common denominator, if you will. Like, what does this contract? What is the projection of this particular description and contract in terms of the ecosystem of languages or tooling that we use? Like, if you're using TypeScript, it might be a different thing. If you're using C-based languages, it's a different thing.
Yeah, I tend to say like the API design version of object-oriented is like object-oriented for dummies, right? Like you got to keep it as simple as possible.
Exactly.
Because you can't use any fancy stuff that might be language-centric. Yeah.
Exactly.
So go on.
So I think that's what, so if you will, that's the conundrum that I ran into when I was, when I came from that background. So I just take that approach that I prefer the approach, if you will, that if your code is working a certain way, it's the truth, right? There's no denying that. So I'm biased towards that because of that reason. But I see value in both sides. There's a trade-off, right? It's what's most appropriate for your organization. Like. To take the flip side, right? The advantage of something like the design first, like you can quickly mock up something, like you can mock a service. That's just not possible, right? Like you have to build out you need like 10 developers to build your service to be able to do that. So I mean, there's a trade-off for everything, and so it's just so I would say just that the SpringFox is a product of the environment that I was in. And it really worked well for that environment, and it may not really work for every environment.
Yeah, that's why I ask your opinion, because I think there's a lot of opinions out there. It doesn't mean any one of us is right. I think one of the contrasting examples for me and why I definitely it's funny, like OpenAPI and kind of the birth of that out of Swagger and kind of Tony Tam's helping get that off the ground and then kind of going off to do something else, and it became the communities, became the Linux Foundations, was also very much a story of transitioning from what was originally a code-first approach into something that's become a design-first approach. And being part of that founding group, it was interesting to see it. I think
Absolutely.
the kind of stories behind that are like teams going off and working for months to develop an API, showing it to somebody for the first time who's going to consume it based on some agreed upfront document version, and then going, this doesn't work at all. This isn't what I needed.
Correct.
And like the horrified executives that like, we spent how much to do that, right? As we're like,
Correct.
I mean, there's certainly bad stories from the past too on like design for, I mentioned before, like governance boards where like, you end up stuck for a month trying to get something out
Correct.
because you got to wait for somebody to green light it.
Correct.
I guess I lean toward like, I'd rather find a way to solve that problem and avoid all that, wasted development effort, because it's the
Correct.
worst feeling in the world,
Absolutely.
versus, accepting status quo and just, kind of going with what it is.
Correct.
But yeah, there's some ideology in there for sure.
Correct. And I think, like, I'd like to add, like there are approaches, right? Like, even if you do that, like the classic problem we're trying to solve is like building walls and making sure they meet in the corner, right? So we want to make sure that we meet. We don't want it to be like, oh my goodness. So there's different ways that you can do that, right? Like there are these they're called CDCs, contract client defined contracts, and that's a development approach, that you say, hey, I'm going to define my contract, and it can be a different form. It doesn't have to be OpenAPI, but now even OpenAPI is supported. But the original, I think it was Martin Fowler again, that
Although I think
brought up this.
Netflix kind of pioneered that one to some extent with their platform, in that all the client devices would define what they want the contract to be based on some superset.
Okay, I think it's this framework called PACS, PACTS, and that's what pioneered it. And there's different other flavors of that contract, but the idea is that you define your contract, and then the builders of that API actually try to build that contract and say, do I think that makes sense or not? And if it doesn't, then I'm going to reject your. It goes really well with the GitHub workflow. So that's another approach. Like rather than having a governance tool, you have like a grassroots tool which is built on the developer workflow. So if your organization is very developer oriented, then that's a good approach to do it as well. So, and that also works with all the contracts as well. So
I've worked with PACS a bit too, and I suppose it probably depends on the environment you're in and kind of the business style. I tend to I've done a lot of SaaS related stuff, and so in the SaaS world, the design first stuff seems to always fit in well, but you could certainly see if
I
you're
love
in
design first. I mean, I don't want to short sell that. I love.
Yeah.
I was like a flag bearer for that for a long time. Became fairly unpopular for that, but that was a sign of the times, not a sign of the approach. So.
Yeah, it's all fashion trends, isn't it? But so the totally topic change. I'm curious your thoughts. We hear a lot that making APIs usable and kind of easy to understand and easy to use and all this is great. And that there's, some people will just go, well, just write great documentation. Some people say, well, just make it. Shouldn't have to have documentation. It should practically explain itself. How have you kind of approached these things in making usable stuff?
I think documentation, the way that I see that is there's three, I see it as three different pillars. And there's a continuum of how much you want to invest in those. The first pillar is, of course, having a definition. That's pretty much everybody, it's like a low-hanging fruit. Everybody does it. Like an OpenAPI specification is people really have that on. Pretty much everybody has that.
Yeah, we mentioned before you could do that up front, or you could end up code genning that after you've built the service. But by the time the thinking about documentation, which is usually too late,
Right.
you have that spec. Okay.
Yeah, the spec actually what it does is it just allows you to create like a REPL for yourself, like if you will, like not really in the traditional sense, but on the web. Just gives you a playground. You just have the definition. You can create a mock. You can create a big Swagger page. The criticism is, of course, this wall of APIs, but it is a REPL. It's an easier curl than what you have on the command line. So there's that aspect, and I think that's pretty much table stakes. Then a little bit more mature organizations really need developer, like what they call developer portal, right? Like you have a portal and you have all your documentation in place, and you say explicitly, okay, this is how you authenticate. This is how typically all the responses, and it's really nice prose. It's not really, you can mix it with some interaction and execution, but it's really nice prose for somebody. You can just give and say, this is how you interact with this service, and this is the service. These are the capabilities, and there's no substitute for prose. If you like for knowledge transfer, for like it's not enough to just give somebody the open API and say, okay, here you go. There might be some fields in there that allow you to do that, but really you need to describe like the deficiency, if you will, of just a spec is that there is no representation of a workflow. There is no way for you to say, how do I get from going in front of the, like if you're buying coffee, if you're standing in line to taking your coffee delivered. Like there are maybe 10 steps in the way where you interact with somebody over the counter, and there's no way to capture that. There's no way for you to say, after you place the order, you get a ticket. After you take the ticket, go to the counter and pass it to the person making your coffee, and then you hand it to them, and then they look at it. Oh, this is your coffee, and they give it back to you. So all of these interactions, there's no way to represent that in OpenAPI. There's only ways to say, you do this, you'll get this response. You do this, you'll get this response. So there's that whole aspect of communicating that whole workflow, which is something that's imperative in the documentation. Otherwise, it's just tribal knowledge. People just know that I have to call this API after this API. So that's very important, right? So that's the second pillar. And I think the third pillar, which is often it's comes mostly as like the Richardson maturity model for REST services. It always comes up as the one thing that people say, okay, I don't need that. So it's the hypermedia capability. What people say HATEOS and stuff like that, but really what it's telling you is that it's giving you control information. In addition to data, it's telling you what you can do next. I think that's important to give you runtime guidance. Like there's design time guidance in terms of documentation, there's runtime guidance. So a lot of people don't do that. And there's different reasons for that. There's mostly the reason I attribute it is to tooling. But people have a way to get around that by like different ways that they come up with. They might have conventions that are part of their API. They might have different ways that they establish those behaviors. But I think it's important to think about those things. The third pillar as well, when you're talking about describing holistically the API.
Cool. You triggered an old memory. I had to go look it up when you were describing the API flow using the coffee shop. It was like REST bucks. Where do I remember that from? I had to look it up. It's the old REST in practice book from 2010.
Yeah.
Wow. Jeez.
That's also a thought worker. I forget his name.
Weber.
Yeah.
Robinson. Yeah.
Yeah. I think he was also a fellow InfoQ contributor.
Okay, that makes sense.
Way back when.
Memories seems to be the theme of the day. So appreciate you sharing memories with us and giving us your take on some of the, how to build great APIs. And Anna, thanks so much for helping out today.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I mean, it's great. Like when you have something you're passionate about, it's enjoyable to talk with other folks that share your same passion. So thank you for this opportunity.
Hardest part about the show is not talking for hours and trying to wrap it up in a reasonable amount of time so it's listenable. I could do this all day. All right, Dilip. Well, I appreciate it. And
absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for listening. If you have a question you want to ask, look in the description of whichever platform you're viewing or listening on, and there should be a link there so you can go submit a question, and we'll do our best to find out the right answer for you.